Hello, everyone. Welcome to the TBR webinar series. Today, Principal Analyst and Practice Manager Angela Lambert will be discussing how speed of HCI market evolution accelerates due to COVID-19. Before we get started, just a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screens, you'll see a series of buttons. From left to right, you can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, survey, information on one of our recent webinars for you to check out, an exclusive free trial offer for folks on the webinar who are new to TBR, and a related content widget where you can download the slide deck and access other materials. These buttons on the bottom of the screen allow you to minimize each window to customize your webinar experience. You can also maximize the slides if you wish to view them in full screen. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a replay link, as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. If you have any questions for us, please submit them via the Q&A widget in On24. You may also reach out to us after the webinar at webinars@tbri.com. Thank you again for joining us, and here's Angela to begin the webinar.
Thanks so much, Haley, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I'm excited to speak with you all. This is Angela Lambert, and as Haley mentioned, I'm a Principal Analyst here at TBR. I focus on our data center research, and so that covers a number of topics across server storage, hyperconverged, hybrid cloud, as well as some of the business models that we see emerging today, like different consumption-based pricing and ways that people are acquiring their data center solutions today. So I'm going to be taking you through some of the key trends and takeaways from our Hyperconverged platform's customer research, with an emphasis on looking at trends that have emerged in the data over the last year and a half. So this is a study that TBR has conducted for a few years, our Hyperconverged platform's customer research. But what we've really been keeping a keen eye on lately is how the data has started to change as we've progressed through the COVID-19 pandemic and what that's looked like from the customer's perspective. So a little bit about our Hyperconverged platform's customer research. As I mentioned, it's a multi-year study at TBR. We've been covering the adoption of this for quite a few years. We field the survey twice per year, once in the spring and once in the fall, and each time we field the survey, we collect 200 respondents. The respondents are located in the United States. They're in companies with as few as 1,000 employees and up to kind of the biggest large enterprises as well participate in the survey. And the types of respondents that are answering these questions are within the IT department. So they're IT decision makers who have purchasing responsibility and participate in purchases of hyperconverged infrastructure and that have made recent purchases in that space. So that's a little bit of background in terms of who we talk to. And again, this research is really focused on tracking the customer's evolving needs, their perceptions of the hyperconverged infrastructure, and how adoption is changing over time and how their workload adoption is changing over time. So as we jump in here, we're going to hit on kind of three main topic areas where we pulled out some data from our survey and kind of highlight what's been changing in the last 18 months or so in terms of the customer perception and behavior. First, we're going to talk about some COVID-19 impacts and how we're seeing that in the data. Overall, we see both short-term and long-term impacts that have resulted during the pandemic. First, looking at the short term, that would be spending. This is where we've already seen some pretty significant changes in the last year and a half. So in this chart, you'll see a year and a half ago, the first half of 2020 is the green bar. When we got at the first half of 2020, the survey fielded just at the cusp of companies in the United States starting to shut down, not a whole lot of budget freezes and spending at that time. You'll see in the second half of 2020, that gray bar, a pretty considerable decrease in the upper spend tiers and an increase in some of these lower spending tiers where we saw hyperconverged spending contract in the second half of 2020. I would say what we see is kind of promising and reassuring news here is that as we fielded the survey in the first half of 2021 this year, that sentiment started, and you see this reflection of companies going a little back more to business as usual in this dark blue bar, and you see that spending has actually really gone kind of right back to where it was at the outset of 2020. So in terms of customer spending, $500,000, $400,000 or more on their hyperconverged annually, the percent of respondents, in those budget tiers is actually, rebounded pretty quickly, which we see as promising. We also see that reflected in the earnings presentations from many of the large data center OEMs. In Q1, a number of different companies reported record revenue growth from 1Q20 to 1Q21. So I think that what we see in this customer data in terms of a recovery of budget and spending in this area does seem to be reflected in what we saw in terms of vendor financials and earnings recently. And it'll be interesting, in the next few weeks as Q2 earnings start to come out, whether that is relatively sustained, which we expect that it probably will be. So that's a little bit on some of the short-term impact trends. When it comes to long-term, I think one of the big trends that has come out of the survey data is, just the kind of the overarching strategy and planning of these IT decision makers and how they're looking at their IT environment. So one of the major changes in mindset we see from last year in 2020 moving into 2021 is an increased desire to consolidate data center space. You see a pretty big increase in terms of the number of respondents who intend to significantly consolidate their data center space in the next 3 years. I think in terms of what customers plan to do with their data center, and our survey data told us that it's a real mix. So hyperconverged is definitely still a big piece of customer strategy. As they do consolidate, they will retain hardware on premises, and a lot of that is likely to be hyperconverged infrastructure that they're using to replace some of their older infrastructure, while other items are moved either into software as a service, public cloud, also increased adoption of co-location data center as well. So this one definitely one to keep an eye on in terms of whether even through the remainder of this year, some companies have started to announce increasing delays in returning to office, whether that has any impact or not in customer sentiment around challenges with managing their data centers, their workforce, and also just how they're supporting their employees who might be working remotely. Another kind of key question that we're always looking to answer with our customer research at TBR is, what are customers actually doing with this technology? So next thing I want to talk about are some hyperconverged use cases that have been coming up in our online survey research. So with hyperconverged, we tend to see that the potential use cases are extremely varied in both our survey research as well as the various enterprise interviews we do throughout the year. But one trend that I think is fairly clear here is that vendors need to prepare to accommodate both the old and the new in terms of workloads being run on hyperconverged. Something that's interesting in this chart on the left to me is that 90% of the respondents we surveyed here are using hyperconverged to replace some traditional server storage and networking. So they're moving already existing workloads from older hardware onto a newer system. So you see for a large proportion of the respondents, 54%, that's their primary use case for hyperconverged. They're consolidating their data center space or refreshing that and choosing hyperconverged over some more traditional data center hardware. Then you have a little less than half of the respondents who are also bringing in some net new use cases as well. One of the things that we've seen here is that there's definitely seems to be a trend with our respondents around hybrid cloud adoption and using their hyperconverged platforms to support that. I think something that points to this and kind of a popular use case being a DevOps use case tying into hybrid cloud adoption and usage on HCI is that we see kind of a big majority of respondents saying they're using some kind of container technology on their hyperconverged platforms, and almost virtually all of them just are not currently using, plan to do so in the future. So we do think that that will be a trend we expect to continue when we interview enterprises who are using hyperconverged infrastructure. The concept of DevOps is one that comes up often in terms of maybe doing some testing and development in public cloud, but they have workloads they want to retain on premises for either performance reasons, compliance, security reasons, where they're moving data back and forth. So that's definitely a trend that we expect to see continue into the future, and we certainly see lots of vendors in the space, announcing different Kubernetes-related offerings and solutions to capitalize on this trend. So that's another big one we see reflecting in the data here. Just a little bit more in terms of some of the broader use cases that we see coming up frequently with our respondents. They are varied. The ones that tend to float to the top are database-oriented and analytics-oriented use cases. So you'll see database management, BI and analytics, CRM databases, IoT, often towards the top of that list in terms of popular use cases with our respondents. To our discussion on the previous slide about hybrid cloud, you also see DevOps about halfway down the list, with close to half of respondents indicating they're using their hyperconverged infrastructure for DevOps as well. So in terms of what we've been seeing and discussing with vendors in the space, go-to-market based on use cases is really kind of a critical takeaway for us right now. And we do see that reflected in many go-to-market approaches. But one thing that has become clear to us in our research with HCI purchasers is that a lot of their decision-making comes down to a vendor's ability to demonstrate competency in the specific use cases they're interested in and evaluating. And that vendor having examples and experience within either their industry or in their specific use case that kind of proves that they have the understanding and capabilities to address those use cases. So again, that's something that from a go-to-market perspective, we do think is really a valuable area to touch on. We've seen a lot of different announcements in terms of, use case oriented, whether that's, for example, in CRM, like an SAP specific solution or kind of specific solutions that align to these use cases that customers are looking for, I think are really valuable in terms of gaining some mind share in the customers. So the third trend that I wanted to touch on today is customer needs and challenges. So the first one that I want to touch on, there are kind of a number of issues or challenges we find that IT purchasers tell us to buy hyperconverged platforms. So replacing outdated hardware, not surprising, as we've seen on previous slides. One of the big use cases we see for hyperconverged here tend to be consolidation of the data center and modernization, trying to get cost and control and management challenges. The one that has been changing over the last 18 months and starting to creep up a bit as we've all been dealing with this pandemic is the lack of IT resources to accommodate a company's needs. So this increase from 34% at the beginning of 2020 to where we are today, up to 42%. That's really kind of showing us that it was a problem before. It definitely is a problem now, and it's likely going to continue to just be an increasing problem. And there's kind of only a few potential options for customers. Either they need to see specific solutions that can address some of these management challenges, possibly look to co-location to help offload some of that challenge. Otherwise, they're, again, kind of that mindset shift we saw where customers are looking more and more towards data center consolidation. I think that these two, data points are likely very closely tied together there. And one solution we see, on the next slide here in terms of ways customers are addressing this, co-location with our respondents, that usage for HCI definitely on the rise. If you look at 1H20, we were at 28% of our respondents having hyperconverged platforms in a co-location environment. Just a year later, up to 38% of our respondents having co-location with their hyperconverged infrastructure. So that's a pretty substantial change, especially when you compare to some of the other places that are keeping their infrastructure, right? So companies have HCI in multiple places, very, very stable in terms of remote locations, pretty consistent in the centralized data centers. I think that the co-location growth is a pretty stable trend, and I would expect that to continue to increase. So it's definitely going to help address that challenge of managing the infrastructure and not having to worry about it, but also having some of the benefits that these customers are used to for an on-premises environment, having some of that control that they desire. We also, in terms of the hybrid cloud trends we addressed on previous slides, I think the co-location facilities provide another benefit for these customers there as well, in terms of often having the stronger network connections to public cloud resources that these customers are likely using. So if they are going towards hybrid cloud use cases, it stands to reason that a co-location facility is going to benefit them in that regard. And on the vendor side, it seems like at least once a month I'm seeing an announcement with some kind of partnership, a company of Equinix or the like, whether it's Dell Technologies, HPE, Pure Storage, have all noted partnerships with co-location providers recently, especially related to consumption-based pricing, and that ability to incorporate the co-location services cost into the cost of the infrastructure and have just kind of a single consumption-based bill for this infrastructure versus having to deal with all of those items individually. Again, just kind of helping to bring in that hybrid cloud strategy that these customers are looking at. And just one other note I would make on the co-location facilities and why I think that they matter and are definitely a relevant trend in the hyperconverged space. We have seen that when it comes to purchasing advice, once customers start moving into co-location environments, especially some of these larger enterprises, they do rely on the co-location providers for their own recommendations on hardware at times. So they will look to these providers for feedback on the type of equipment they purchase and run themselves in those facilities, and as well as look to their partnerships to help make the procurement process just simpler for them and reduce some of the stress and challenge. So I think that as we see these partnerships develop, that's really going to be beneficial for HCI vendors because the co-location providers are an avenue of influence for the end customer. So last trend I wanted to talk about on this slide would be a bit on some of the additional hybrid cloud offering trends that we're seeing. One of the questions in this survey is just if you are using hybrid cloud or if you're planning to, who are the vendors that you would consider in this space? What I would take away from this slide or this data is essentially, we see Microsoft, Azure, and AWS kind of at the top of the list here. The list is very focused on hyperconverged specific offerings for the most part, given that all of these customers are hyperconverged purchasers. So certainly there are other offerings out there. For me, the takeaway I would say is that if customers are already in a public cloud environment, they are pretty likely to look to that public cloud vendor when they're starting to build out their hybrid cloud strategy. So again, this is going to be another big place where we feel that alliances are important because customers are ultimately going to be looking for the path of least resistance here in terms of a solution that is easy to integrate with assets that they already have and also easy to manage or easy to work into the way they currently manage their assets. So that doesn't really surprise me to see public cloud vendors at the top of the list here. And I think more and more commonly we see some alliances forming between these vendors. Obviously, Microsoft is extremely reliant on its OEM partners in the hybrid cloud space as they don't provide hardware of their own. But these alliances we do think will be valuable going forward. I would also note, especially to keep in mind, this is a survey of hyperconverged infrastructure purchasers. So you see Dell Technologies Cloud Platform third there. I just wanted to call out that in this survey, given that Dell does have a fairly large market share in the HCI space, you do see their customers very well represented in our survey, so that I do think pulls through a little bit here. And so just just wanted to call that out as a consideration as you're looking at this data, that there are kind of a fairly heavy amount of Dell customers in our survey based on market share. So when we're looking at hybrid cloud solutions, that probably has some impact on this data as well, compared to just the general marketplace of mid-market and enterprise customers. Again, so here we're really just strictly looking at hyperconverged infrastructure customers. So I've talked through, the kind of some COVID-19 trends, use case trends, some challenges and way that customers are trying to address these challenges. I see we do have a few questions in the Q&A box now. I'm going to just pause for a moment to read through a few of those. But in the meantime, if you have additional questions, feel free to pop those into the box, and we'll try to jump through those. So let me just take one moment here to start pulling through these questions. So thanks to everyone who has submitted some questions so far. A couple of the questions are related to some of the topics we were just discussing on the last slide. So I think I may actually hop back there for just a moment, so we have that visual as we're going through here. So one question was just an interest in hearing how the AWS Outpost data has changed in this study from our results, a couple of years back. While I do not have the data in front of me for our initial survey results on AWS Outpost, I can speak to a little bit of what I've seen and heard from different individuals I've spoken to in the market over the last few months. I would say that in our early survey data, my recollections were that there was extremely strong hype for this offering as it was announced and before it was rolled out, and we saw very high interest in our survey respondents in trying out the AWS Outpost offering. In conversations I've had with customers at enterprises in the last few months, I think some of the feedback I've heard, granted anecdotally, but some of the feedback I've heard is that AWS Outpost serves a really specific and niche use case. So AWS Outpost is not seen as a solution that is very multi-cloud friendly. AWS is not super easy to connect to other public clouds if you're a company that uses maybe Microsoft Azure or any other solutions. Outpost is really focused on connecting some on-premise hardware to your AWS public cloud. So customers have realized that and are aware of that. It's not really a solution for everything for that reason. Customers also acknowledge that the solution can get fairly costly to run, and it's not always their choice to run on a large scale. So that is a little bit of feedback that I have gotten in that area as some enterprises have actually tried it out. So that idea of being friendly to the broader ecosystem, and AWS with the solution is not really acknowledging that customers are not exclusive AWS users. So in comparison, Microsoft Azure has gotten some better feedback than AWS in that area in terms of flexibility in kind of fitting into a multi-cloud environment, which I think there was another comment in here, curious or surprised to see that Azure Stack HCI is high given their share is low today. Do we see moves by Nutanix and VMware not having as much uptake? I would say that my guess in terms of respondents answering this question and just the high share of responses is that they may think back a bit more broadly and selecting that as an option versus maybe just specifically the hyper-converged flavor of Microsoft Azure Stack. I know there are kind of a number of different offerings under that umbrella. So I would probably agree that it's probably not an extremely dominant offering, at least to that degree, specific to the hyper-converged flavor. But again, kind of the overarching trend there, I think what I see with the customers is they're probably looking at it from the overall Azure Stack portfolio. Let me see here. So we have kind of a number of other questions coming in. So I'll just pause for one moment to pull a couple of additional questions forward. Okay, so just another kind of more general comment that as we had talked about data center consolidation earlier in the presentation, this is something that's been around for a long time. We're curious to know where customers have workloads, where they plan to have them as a gauge that kind of reflects their overall strategies and their withdrawal strategies, such as going all in on AWS, but realizing that it's not as easy and there's not as much in cost savings. So this is something that we are keenly trying to track, and I think going forward in our data center portfolio and some of our planned research, broader than just simply hyper-converged specific customers. This is something that we're hoping to be able to have some more publishable research on in terms of actual migration strategies and things that either are still being migrated to cloud and what things are being retained. In our recent customer conversations, I would agree we do hear customers. I think that the conversation with customers has shifted. They're no longer expecting cost savings when they do move to public cloud. Some of the customers acknowledge that it may even be a more expensive choice than just running something on premises. So part of that consideration is not only cost, it's also some other trade-offs the company may be looking at in terms of agility, primarily being one customers speak to often, or just, again, not having the core competency in running their own data center. So I would agree that customers today are acknowledging there's not a real cost savings that they're seeing in cloud, and they are being more judicious. Hopefully, we can get some more hard data on that to share some upcoming research as well on the specific use cases. Another workload question, do we see use case differences between VMware and Nutanix Hyperconverged? I don't believe that we have the specific data broken out based on the type of platform these respondents are using, but that's certainly something I can check with our data team on, whether that's something we can get to, and I'm happy to follow up with the person who asked that question and provide additional info there as well. Similarly, what percentage of SAP workloads run on HCI? We may have possibly some supplemental data on whether there are SAP databases. If not in this research, I think it's something we may have surveyed on in previous studies, and I may also be able to share that as a potential follow-up email. Unfortunately, I don't have it in front of me now. A couple of other questions. Just again, with going back to the consumption-based topic, seems like lack of IT resources will accelerate SaaS and managed services, like some of the consumption-based models. So that could include Dell Technologies Apex, HP GreenLake. We've got Lenovo's TrueScale, NetApp Keystone. I could probably go on and on listing the different types. I would agree that I think the lack of resources are help there in terms of promoting demand for those offerings. That is another area where we are launching, the data center team is launching some research this fall, so stay tuned for some upcoming research that's going to be coming out on consumption-based pricing models, because we're going to be looking at adoption drivers and different vendor strategies as part of that. And then there's a couple of questions on why we have Anthos and Outpost in the survey when they're not really, true hyperconverged platforms. Really, the true answer there is because clients who have consumed this research, frankly, just want to know about those platforms and whether or not they're a threat. So they aren't really a like-for-like solution in terms of how their actual hardware necessarily, but people wanted to know about them and whether they're going to maybe detract from the hyperconverged market in some way. So that is why we included them as a hybrid cloud option. Another question, how does disaggregated HCI fit into consolidation as we discussed? I think that's an interesting question. What feedback I do have, and that may be a potential expansion area in upcoming hyperconverged customer research for us, customer views on DHCI. What I have heard in my own market conversations is definitely that the need is obviously there for it, right? I mean, that's the pendulum swung in the direction of, purchase this box. It's got all the compute, storage, memory optimized. Here you go. Customers adopted that, realized that they were wasting some of their resources because their workloads weren't a perfect fit. Now the pendulum is swinging in a direction. We did have a survey question, one small question about whether or not customers feel it is challenging to match hyperconverged infrastructure with their specific workload needs in terms of their compute and storage, and whether that's a challenge for them in the purchase process. There was some agreement from customers that has been a challenge in the past. So, I would suspect that these types of offerings will be beneficial for those customers who may have disproportionate computer storage needs. There's a question about whether we've covered Oracle and Cisco's engineered systems and HCI. Cisco is covered in, there are Cisco customers represented in this survey. I don't think they were shown on that hybrid cloud question. However, they are represented in the survey. Oracle, I do not think we have Oracle customers represented in this survey. So there's, let's see, just a couple of other questions, and if any final thoughts, feel free to share them now. There is one question. I would love some more details on what you'd like to know here. What are the alternatives to hyperconverged infrastructure? That is a very broad one. If you have any more detailed thoughts, feel free to share. But frankly, from my perspective, it could be anything from traditional server storage networking all the way to just saying, forget it, I'm moving this to a SaaS solution or public cloud. So I would say that there's always kind of a very broad range of alternatives. So I'm sorry if that was not a good answer to your question, but if you have a more specific one, feel free to share also. Let's see. Relatively, what's the market size comparison between HCI and our overall data center? We do have, TBR does have a forecast where we forecast the total data center market, and we also do a very rough sizing of the hyper-converged infrastructure space. Again, another area we're hoping to expand in our portfolio coverage over the next year. But while I don't have the specific percentages, HCI is still relatively small if you're comparing the entire data center market, especially just because the x86 server business is so vast, so much server consumption going on with both enterprises and hyperscalers and the like. However, I would say that if you looked at the growth rates in our hyperconverged projections versus overall data center, I think you would see that hyperconverged still has, we are projecting stronger growth rates there. Well, it is smaller relative to the overall data center market. Okay. Do I know why Anthos is low on this slide here, hybrid cloud offering? My honest take on that would be, it may partly be reflective of the fact that the market share in the enterprise of Azure and AWS are just quite a bit higher than Google in terms of public cloud adoption. So I think those probably just fall in line in terms of their usage. I have heard in interviews with enterprise customers, I've heard positive things about Anthos from those enterprises who have worked with it, but they're just a little far and few between in terms of my own personal conversations compared to people who are using Azure or AWS today. There's one question wondering if respondents have provided feedback on Red Hat hyperconverged growth in the future. Off the top of my head, I do not have any feedback in that area, but I welcome that question from you, and I think that's another great topic we may be able to try to incorporate in some of our upcoming research. So thank you for sharing that question. And then lastly, I see talking about containers used on HCI. I had mentioned DevOps. Are there some actual use cases that I've seen happening? So I know I mentioned this briefly earlier in the presentation. And unfortunately, it's probably not too much more detail, but some of the most recent conversations I've had in talking to enterprise customers were customers in industry verticals that have a lot of regulation. Large banks or financial institutions, public sector was another one, maybe even healthcare or some biotech individuals that we've spoken with. Those have been, some common customer types that we've talked to when they've brought up containers and wanting to use on-premises infrastructure to build some type of hybrid cloud so they can take advantage of maybe they may have developers who want to build apps in public cloud, but ultimately they have a lot of data that they're not willing to move up there. Those were the specific types of use cases that I had heard in recent conversations. So financial transactions was a big one that came up in this specific area, not wanting to have any of the customer or financial data in public cloud, but they have their own proprietary applications that they are developing or have some pieces running in public cloud. So sorry if that, I hope that provides at least a little bit of additional detail, but that's certainly an area that we're going to be continuing to look at and asking more and more customers about. So I think that covers a lot of the questions. Thank you all for submitting questions. I can't hear you, but it's nice to hear from you, at least through the chat window. So just as I wrap up here, and Haley kind of takes us out, just a couple of FYIs on related research if you're interested in kind of some of our other portfolio offerings that might provide more insight. The first report on the screen here is data we pulled from today, our Hyperconverged platforms customer research. If you're a current client, you can just log in to access these reports. If not, there is a link on the screen where you can click through to be set up with a trial to access some of this content. We do have a market landscape, as I mentioned, specific to the size of the hyperconverged market. There are some high-level estimates in there. We also have a annual data center market forecast we publish at the beginning of the year. I would definitely check that out if you're interested in comparing those sizes. We have a co-location benchmark, certainly could be interesting regarding some of the trends we're talking about today. Our vendor report coverage on specific vendors that covers their quarterly financials. And lastly, as I mentioned, coming up this fall, we have a new market landscape that's focused all on consumption-based pricing models from the HPE GreenLake-esque and beyond type of offerings that they're proliferating the market today. So there will be more TBR research coming out on those topics in the next couple of months. So thanks again, and Haley, I will turn it back to you to close us out.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Angela. Thank you, everybody, for attending, for your time today, and for your questions. If you have any more follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to Angela. Her email is up on the screen. If you have a few moments, it would be greatly appreciated if you could fill out the survey on your screen, and a replay version of the webcast will be available after the event and will be sent out to all of you via email. To view a list of our upcoming and past webinars, please visit tbri.com. And thank you all, and have a great rest of your day.